All right, so today's scripture reading comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verses 8 to 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil imprisoned some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Noah. I was kind of debating going back and forth in my head if I should say anything about the Maple Leafs, but Noah took care of that, so I figure my job is to give the sermon, not to give a sports update. But yeah, thank you, Noah. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Leanne and choir, and Michelle and Heather and Scott for leading us in some worship songs, and for the various announcements and people who have taken place to get us where we are so far. We're continuing on in our series from Revelation 2 and 3. We're looking at Jesus' words to the 7 churches, and we're seeing what we can learn, what he has to say to them, and what we can take from that and apply to our own life here at Bedford Baptist. So there's, in these 7 letters, as we'll see, or in these 7 churches that he addresses, he has lots of things to say. He has some good things, some bad things, some corrections to make, but I almost feel as though I've lucked out a bit because the church of Smyrna that he addresses, that Noah read for us, he doesn't have any bad things to say. He doesn't have any corrections or rebukes. So rather than this morning being a time of looking at the bad things the church has done and the corrections that Jesus had, we won't be thinking of, okay, what have they done that we can avoid doing, but we'll be talking this morning about, okay, what have they done that we can not necessarily try to exactly recreate here, but what can we learn from what they've done and how they've kind of embodied church, and how can we implement that into our DNA here at Bedford Baptist? And so I think the key thing that Jesus wants us to hear from his words to the church of Smyrna, he wants to commend them for being faithful to him even when times have been tough. And he also goes on to say, continue to be faithful to me because times will not get easier. Times are going to continue to be tough. You'll face more persecution and more suffering. So continue and your faithfulness to me. And when I was reading this passage and I was thinking about it, an illustration quickly came to mind, and that was of my 21st birthday, which was a handful of years ago. But it was actually the day before my birthday. I was folding laundry in my room, and next thing I know, as I was folding this laundry, I had a blindfold placed over my head. I was tackled to the ground, and I had a rope tied behind my back. Yeah, I have great friends. And I was drug out and put in the back of someone's car. But before I even had time to panic, I couldn't see, but I recognized the voices of who it was that was doing these things. And I quickly realized that, okay, I was not being kidnapped. There was nothing terrible happening, but these were in fact my friends, and they were trying to, in a somewhat malicious way, celebrate my 21st birthday. So there I am getting thrown into the back of a car. All the while, I don't know where I'm going, what's happening, but I recognize the voices, and I have an idea of who it is that's in charge of this. So even though it's a bit nerve-wracking, I don't know what's about to happen, where we're going, what's going on, but I knew who it was that was leading me into these mysterious events. And yes, there were times where I was like, okay, what on earth is going to happen to me? But I was able to, at least for the majority of time, maintain a level of calmness because I knew who it was that was leading me through these events. And I think that's what Jesus is commending the church of Smyrna for. They've gone through some difficult times, not anything quite like that experience. It was much worse. But they recognized who it was that was leading them, who was with them through these difficult times. And because of that, they were able to remain faithful to him. So he commends them for that. And then he goes on to say, there's more coming. So remember that faithfulness that you had to me and continue to be faithful as times will continue to be difficult. And as Noah mentioned in the scripture reading, Jesus makes reference to this church of this synagogue of Satan. And this might come across as a weird language to us, but let me just kind of parse out what I believe him to be saying. So at this point in church history with who Jesus was referring to, there was not a distinct marker between Judaism and Christianity. So when Jesus is when he's talking about the Jews, he's not so much talking about a distinct religion or a distinct group of people from the followers of Jesus, but there was really a tie-in between the Jewish people and the followers of Jesus. And to be a true follower of Jesus, you are kind of also being a true Jew at the same time. I know we think of today, there are two distinct religions, but we still share the majority of our text is the same. So what Jesus is doing here is I believe he's acknowledging a group of people in the city of Smyrna that are converting to Judaism not because they want to honor the God of their faith, but because there was a certain stigma in the culture. There was a certain kind of badge of honor that came with identifying with the Jewish faith. Because in that time and in that context, there were lots of kind of social and personal benefits that came with it. The Jewish people were thought of highly. So people were joining this faith not because they wanted to honor God, but because it came with a certain level of personal fame, personal honor. And Jesus addresses that. He says, I know. He knows everything that they had gone through. He recognizes that some of these Jews were being hypocritical, and he calls them a synagogue of Satan. And some of us, we might be drawing parallels in our context, in our world today. We might, think of, it's hard to be a Christian in our day and age. But there's one thing that if you read about the early church, you'll notice that although the early church, many Christians faced persecution, faced suffering, they were quiet about it, and they didn't cry out that they were being persecuted. They didn't cry out, "Woe is me," but they were able to endure it because they knew the God that was with them and that was leading them through. But in the same way, being a Christian today, it's not an easy badge to wear. Being a follower of Jesus now is quite different than it was, say, 50, 40, 30, 20, even 10 years ago. Times have changed. Maybe it's a little different in other parts of the world. I know I experienced that in Uganda. There was a certain level of honor that came with being a Christian, but I would say for the most part, in most of our contexts today, it is different. Christians are not portrayed well, typically, if you watch the news, if you see things in the media. An example of this, I help out at this youth drop-in center on Wednesdays, and we were playing, a group of us were playing a game of cards, and as Canadians do, we were just making small talk, and the way Canadians usually do that is talking about, things like the weather and what we do for school and for work and whatnot. So when it came to me, I said, I told them who I was and said I'm a pastor, I'm a youth pastor. And it was interesting to see just kind of the sudden change in demeanor and seeing kind of the disgust run over some people's faces. And immediately my thought was I wanted to put a dividing line between what I did and what maybe their interpretation of what a pastor was. I wanted to separate myself from, I'm not one of those pastors in the Bible Belt in the southern states, and I'm not one of these crazy guys. But I kept my mouth shut, because I recognized that, what Jesus died for and the shame that he carried and the weight of our sin was so much greater than that. And he, despite all the horrible labels and things attached to that, he was silent, and he suffered for the sake of the world. And I think there's something too when, Jesus' last words in his life on earth were praying for unity. Because I think the last thing we need is, for us to create more dividing lines in us versus them. So as hard as it was, I kept my mouth shut, and they could identify me however they wanted to. And I just want to take a moment to commend our young people, commend our youth around who are following Jesus today, because it's not an easy thing to do. As I mentioned, being a Christian in today's world is much different than it was several years ago. People in school today who follow Jesus, they're very much going against the grain. They're losing out on friendships, on social status. So for someone to be a youth who is following Jesus today, if you have a moment, honestly, I recommend take a moment to chat with them, to listen to them and learn from them, what it's like, and ask how you can be praying, because it's really commendable to be a young person who's following Jesus when everyone in the world is going in the opposite direction. And Jesus says to the church of Smyrna that even though they suffer, he says that they are rich. And Jesus isn't talking about wealth. He's not talking about money or status. But Jesus is saying that even though they suffer, they're rich in the heart. Last week, Pastor Scott talked about Jesus' words to the church of Ephesus, and he talked about how Jesus commended them for doing all these good things. But towards the end of that, he says, even though you're doing all these good things, he says that they lost their first love. Or in other words, that they were doing good things, but they lost the heart behind what they were doing. Or as I'll say it here, they were doing the right things, but they were poor in heart. And when Jesus addresses the church of Smyrna, he doesn't so much talk about all the good things they've done, but he commends them for being faithful through their hardships, and encourages them to continue to be faithful even as times get tough. And there's, I think, a question that's in all of this that I want to address. And that's, according to Jesus, they've been good, they've done good. But that question that some of us might be asking this morning is, well, if they've been good, then why is God allowing these bad things to continue to happen to him? As we hear a potential bad thing happening outside with the sirens. And I think it's a question that we all face at some point in our lives. It might not be the specific question, but I think most of us have either asked ourselves or we've heard this question, well, why do bad things happen to good people? It's something that I've addressed here before, but it's something that, we keep coming back to. But I think it's important that we address it again. And this question comes from assuming that God works in ways that are cause and effect. We assume that someone does something good, that they should immediately be rewarded for it. If they do something bad, then they should be punished for it. And people see religion as, people serving a God who rewards people for the good things they do and punishing them for the bad things they do. But this isn't the character of the God that we read about in our Bibles. God works in mysterious ways, and he doesn't immediately punish us for the bad things we do or reward us for the good things we do. In the same way, there's a saying that I hear sometimes that there could be more to it, but I often hear us Christians say, we're so blessed to live where we do in the world, or to experience the things we experience. We're grateful to God that we live here in Nova Scotia and we don't live in another part in the world that experiences some awful things. And I think there's something to that, and I understand. But then I'm brought back to some of the words that Jesus says of those who are truly blessed. I think back to a sermon series that we would have done about a year ago on the Beatitudes. And Jesus said that blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the persecuted. And when I hear these words, and then I hear us talk about us being blessed for having it easy here in Nova Scotia, there's just something that's slightly unsettling, and that just makes me wonder, what does it mean to actually be blessed? Because Jesus says that the church in Smyrna is blessed, even though they don't have it easy like the way we think a blessed person might. And here in Nova Scotia, we might not be going through the same things. Well, in fact, I can pretty well guarantee that we're not going through the same things. But many of us are going through difficult times, or going through hardships. I know in the last week or two, I've had plenty of conversations, there's been plenty of news that some of us have gone through difficult things. And I don't want to pretend like it's been easy. But can I just remind us that our hardships, our suffering, they're not a result of the bad things we've done. We're not being punished. But rather, God is using, in a mysterious way, he's using all these things to make his glory known. When Jesus and his disciples came across a blind man, the disciples asked Jesus, well, why is it that he ended up like this? Who sinned? Was it him? Was it his parents, his parents' parents? But Jesus immediately escapes from this narrative. And he doesn't answer in the same story. He says that these things happen so that the glory of God might be made known. In the book of Isaiah, it says that his ways are not like our ways, they're above our ways. His thoughts are above our thoughts. Jesus didn't follow this cause and effect narrative that we so often find ourselves in, because he knew that God uses all things good, all things bad, all things in general, for his purposes and his glory. And I think all of this kind of begs the question, well, why do we bother doing this? Why do we be faithful to God when we're experiencing suffering, when we're experiencing perhaps persecution? Because maybe you're someone who doesn't identify as a follower of Jesus, or maybe you're someone who just thinks that it's a little too extreme to be faithful to God, depending on what you're going through. You might be thinking, well, I have so much going on in my own life right now that I can't continue to deal with what I'm going through, but at the same time, be faithful to God. But I just want to remind us of the one who it is that's saying these words to the churches, which is Jesus. In verse 8, the first verse that we looked at in this passage, Jesus says, I am the first and the last, the one who died and came back to life. And Jesus says to them, he says to the church, he says, I know everything that they've been through, all the suffering and the persecution. Jesus says, I know. He's aware of the synagogue of Satan, these hypocritical Jews. He knows of the suffering. He knows even of the suffering that's coming their way. It doesn't catch him by surprise. it doesn't catch him off guard, but he knows and he's aware of it all. But he also doesn't say that he will stop it. He's aware of everything that's happened and that's going to happen. And like some of us might think might be the right thing to do is Jesus would come and intervene and say, okay, I'll bring a stop to this injustice. But he doesn't say that. He actually says that there's more to come. There's more suffering on the way. And he encourages them to maintain the same faithfulness that they previously had into their coming suffering. So it would be wrong for me to stand here and say that if you just be a little more faithful, that God will bring an end to your suffering. Because unlike Jesus, I'm not a prophet. I can't see the future. I don't know. Maybe for some people, the hard things you're going through might end tomorrow. They might end the next day. Maybe for some of you, they won't. Maybe they'll continue for a long time. But what I can say that Jesus says here is to remain faithful to him. Whether the going gets easier or more difficult, be faithful to the one who is faithful to us and faithful to God, even when we couldn't be. Because Jesus endured suffering more than any of us could ever imagine. He was persecuted beyond belief, but he made it through to the other side. He was able to fully experience the glory of God. And as someone who suffered to the level that he did, he's able to look at us and say that he knows what we're going through. He knows the hardships and the sufferings, but he knows that God's plan, God's glory, is all worth more than any of that. So we can trust in him. And his plan might not make sense this afternoon. It might not make sense tomorrow, in 10 or 20 years from now, but one day it will. But in the meantime, we can be faithful to the one who is first faithful to us and to God, and who embodies faithfulness itself. So in conclusion, just let me recap what we've talked about. So what makes us rich is not our money, our wealth, our status, but what makes us rich is our faith and our faithfulness in and to Jesus. We might have nothing going for us, but if our faith is in Jesus, the Bible promises us that we are rich. And can I also just remind us that these big why questions, these trying to tie the dots of why these big world events happen and trying to connect the dots is not our task to do. Because we're living here in a finite time and culture, but God can see beyond all of that. So at times when you just feel the urge to explain something away, can I just encourage us, can I challenge us to let go and just let God be God and the one who answers all of our questions? And finally, I know that some of us are going through a lot. Things are hard, and it might not seem appealing or easy to remain faithful to God, but can I just encourage us to not burn ourselves out, and that whatever we're going through, that we could give it to God and trust in his faithfulness and trust that he is working all things for the glory of God. So let's be faithful to the one who embodies faithfulness.